ELEX II ELEX from Piranha Bytes was a decent package for those that enjoy their RPGs with a hearty helping of old-school sensibilities on the side. It prioritized its signature challenge and grind-heavy action of the gameplay before all else, even polish, narrative cohesion, and fun combat. And yet, somehow ELEX managed to make it all work well enough to be a decent game. ELEX II, for better and for worse, mostly treads those same waters. With only a small handful of improvements over its predecessor and a couple new problems of its own, ELEX II succeeds in little more than being another ELEX game for those who dug the first one. The elephant in the room here, and perhaps ELEX II's greatest achievement, is the densely packed open world that feels very much more like the dystopian sci-fi world Magalan that the first game wanted to be. Not because it's particularly large or detailed, though, but rather, because of what inhabits it. Between members of the game's 5 major factions, the eclectic assortment of monsters that range from giant trolls, to raptors, to flying insects, and even crazier things, you won't be running around for very long before running into something of interest. The problem is, of course, with ELEX II's complete disregard for pacing of any sort. 1 second you might be slaying small monsters way under your level, then the next, getting one-shotted by a giant robot that's exponentially stronger than you. ELEX II actually takes place not too long after the first game. The main character, Jax, has left his wife and young son after sort of saving the world. An alien race is threatening Magalan, the game's stand-in for Earth, and Jax must both reconcile with his family and try to unite the planet's warring factions. As in the first game, the various factions are in conflict over the planet's most valuable resource, ELEX. One of the factions, the Elves, consumes it for its logic-enhancing power. The downside is that the ELEX also dulls the emotions and turns the Elves into unfeeling automatons. Other factions use ELEX for magic, and some, like the clerics, are entirely against the use of ELEX altogether. Both ELEX and ELEX II have layered and interesting premises. The world and politics of Magalan make sense and the relationships of the factions generates the story and quests. The game begins with Jax becoming infected with an alien disease. He goes on a quest to find a cure, and likewise to find his son, Dex. His wife has entrusted young Dex with some freedom fighters, so Dex tracks the boy down and tries to make amends. After reuniting with Dex, Jax and his son travel to a sanctuary that serves as a hub area. From there, Jax sets off on a very large number of quests and side quests to convince the factions that the alien threat is real, often with Dex in tow. This leads to some unintentionally hilarious dialogue that seems to ignore whatever situation father and son are in. There's a bit where Jax and his grizzled ex decide that he should spend more time with their son. And so he literally accompanies you out of the enclave, you, armed with a rusty sword and 2/3 of a breastplate. As I fought off monsters with no discernible science to their level banding, at one point I got separated from him. I backtracked and found him just standing in a bit of wasteland with 3 huge monsters wandering about. I dutifully rescued him, and then when I fast traveled back to the enclave that was it. He just stayed there. What's worse is I feel this little episode was a clumsy attempt to make us care about Jax's life and character, but it was awful. Later, when Jax's wife became a tag-along companion, we happened to visit the place I'd left the kids 6 odd hours before. I expected a tearful family reunion and instead they all just stared blankly at each other. There wasn't even a dialogue where the parents greeted their child after a week in the wildlands. My point is that for all the world building and roaming enemies, Magalan is a lifeless husk of a game world. ELEX II is classified as vintage, but that seems to mean based on Fallout 3. There are nice ideas, like the jetpack you're given at the start. A world where everyone is in medieval castles probably needs jetpacks more than, say, adequate plumbing, so I guess it makes sense somewhere. But ELEX II is held back by its creator's ambition. You'll need to recruit merchants and soldiers and warriors, and create a die-hard army to fight off the Skyands from your developing headquarters. The questing that facilitates this, though, is a slow, ponderous mix of fetch quests and kill quests. There's a counter that registers how many fast travel teleporters you've found, but not how many there are in total, so why count them at all? You can stealth around, but the jetpack means you're never locked out of anywhere. Guards turn you away, completely oblivious to the fact that even a non-upgraded jetpack could clear their perimeter fence twice over. So you will abuse it, and that coupled with roaming monsters means you'll get into scrapes. Combat in ELEX II is horrendous. Weapons have no impact and no accuracy. The engine strains under the weight of fast movement and bleeds frames everywhere. Jax slides around angry monsters as barely existent hitboxes clumsily collide. There's a mix of melee, magic and ranged weaponry, and a variety of armor to suit your style. But because monster leveling has the delicate balance of a trifle resting on a pneumatic drill, you can't tell when you're going to be ganked by some wandering dog monster you just killed 5 off with as much difficulty as blowing your nose. Combat is clunky, plain and simple. Character movement requires a little timing just because all actions take extra time. This works well enough because enemy AI lacks the kind of sophistication to require deep understanding of combat mechanics. Attack a few times, walk away, and watch the enemy charge at thin air. Both you and the enemy have access to quick attacks as well as charge attacks, but quick attacks don't do anywhere near as much damage. Enemies hit quickly and often get in random cheap shots due to being locked on. Charge attacks do not lock on and basically miss as long as you move. Combat is clunky, but the limitations affect both you and your enemies. This doesn't wash away the issues, but this does make them easier to get used to. Elsewhere, you get a simple skill tree that coincides with 5 basic stats that you apply points to, such as strength, constitution, and dexterity. Each skill requires some kind of combination of points in each stat to level up, so you can't just do everything at once. I appreciate this because getting overpowered too quickly makes the game boring. Leveling up happens in the usual manner and there are no real surprises here. You can advance attributes like strength and dexterity if you choose, utilizing skill points in the skill tree depending on how you see your own personal Jax life playing out. It's a really solid RPG in those terms, one that will give you loads of hours of gameplay to play with. It is a tricky game though, and even when you think you'll be able to cope, getting overwhelmed in fights is standard. ELEX II's visuals are good, although not the best I've seen, pretty solid throughout. The world that is ripe for exploration is nice though, and there are some beautiful places to be, but I found the character and enemy designs to be nothing more than just okay in relation to other open world games. That said, and considering the size of the team at work here, when you put ELEX II up in context with other big AAA games, they have done a remarkable job. The soundtrack is good and the voice acting does a great job throughout too, joining up the writing well. It could be argued that something was lost in translation, since Piranha Bytes is a German developer and I'm playing the game in English, but I think that's just being terribly unfair to all the lovely Germans I've encountered in my lifetime. It would also ignore the fact that the same unpleasantness isn't restricted to NPC dialogue. ELEX II, like its predecessors, has a problem with women. It's not quite as front and center as in earlier titles from the developer, since there are a good amount of fully clothed female characters, but the attitude on display is shockingly backwards. The women in the game are bitchy harridans, jealous and spiteful. When I decided to have Jax continue his relationship with Kaija, a character from the first game who he had since had a child with and then abandoned, both of the other women in his entourage reacted negatively, losing loyalty. That's one character who I'd hardly interacted with, and another who verbally abused Jax at every opportunity. I had no idea they even were potential romance options, but of course they hated Jax hooking up with another woman. As you may be able to guess, none of the male characters had the same reaction. Speaking of Jax, he isn't any better. No matter what options you choose, he will be rude, angry and shouty at every opportunity. For me, this came to a head during a late-game conversation with his son, Dex, who is, for the record, 7 or 8 years old at most, where I was presented with the option to threaten to beat him. Worse still, at least one of the companion characters will approve of that decision. Even with the general nastiness of the characters in the game, this blindsided me, forced me out of the game and away from my computer for some time. ELEX II looks exactly like the first, with a campaign almost identical to its predecessor, with very few innovations introduced, but still presenting some improvements in the graphic, technical and stylistic side. It is certainly a game suitable for an audience accustomed to open world with sci-fantasy settings, but which, like its predecessor, will probably not be able to reach a large portion of the public. I have had a harder time deciding on a review rating for ELEX II than I have had for any game I have reviewed so far. It had probably the poorest start to a game I've seen in a while, But if you can get past it, I think RPG fans will really enjoy what's there. But truth be told, I don't know how much it will convince anyone who isn't a fan of the genre. I am disappointed that this game is coming out in such a crowded time because I think it deserves some of the attention that is going elsewhere right now. Hopefully people to whom the game will appeal don't miss out, and I really hope that THQ Nordic authorizes another sequel because I can tell you that I would love to dive back in Jax's shoes.